We're not doing one this month because we did Ember 101 workshop. That was a lot of fun too. And then the third Tuesday of the month, we have a Bring Your Own Project night, which is a great opportunity for folks to come in with their projects and get some over-the-shoulder help from sort of all kinds of people who have a little bit of experience with all kinds of technology. That's a really good one too. And then we also have the North County meetups, which are the third or fourth Tuesday of the month, which are up at Walmart Labs. Walmart Labs in Carlsbad. Check it out. Check it out on meetup.com. All of our meetups, all of our upcoming meetups are posted there, so you have the ability to scope it out, see if you want to actually make it out to any of the fun stuff that we do. My name's Abhishek Gray. I am one of the organizers. I am also joined tonight by Stuart, the newest organizer. He just joined us, I think, last week. So welcome, Stuart. And also Scott, who usually hosts the North County meetups. We are currently at EvoNexus. For those of you that don't know, EvoNexus is an incubator. It is a nonprofit organization that hosts small startups. When they come in with a big idea, they can apply with EvoNexus to be hosted for a period, like 6 months or something like that. And if you get approved, you get access to this great facility. There's a lot of other perks that are in some brochure somewhere. But the ping pong is probably the best perk, right over there, which you're currently sitting in the ping pong court. But for presentations, it's you guys. If you park downstairs, parking is free. Parking is validated. The validator is right here, right behind this little table. So just talk that guy whenever you are on your way out. It's good for 4 hours, so no stress. Let's see what else. So we are always on the lookout for new speakers. We actually have a lot of different topics that come through, and we love to have people who come in with whatever they're really passionate about speaking about. We do prefer lightning talks. We do prefer short talks that don't go really over 15 minutes. If you have something that you're really passionate about that is going to take you past that, we can certainly try to find a way to work that in. Either way, come talk to me or any of the other organizers here tonight if you're interested. You can always reach out to us on the meetup.com website or through sandiegojs.org. Now, tonight we actually have 2 talks.
Or if you have a longer talk, North County meetups and usually you need 1 talk. So we got over 45 minutes to have a long talk on something. We're looking for a speaker for this one.
Cool. Tonight's talk is actually by Andy Fleming. He will be talking about both Angular 2 and TypeScript. These are 2 back-to-back talks. So without further ado, Andy.
Hello. So tonight you mentioned we're splitting up talks. So if you've ever been to a meetup in North County called Full Stack Talks, they follow this format. And basically the way they do it is they do 2 short talks with kind of a short break in between, and then they do a lab, typically having to do with the second talk. That way people can kind of get some hands-on time, or if you don't care too much about the topic, you can just socialize a little more. The goal is to not have the talks drag on, to just have quick, short bits where you can, get an idea about something new like Angular 2, and then can kind of decide if you want to dig more into that. So I'll be doing that. And yeah, I'm going to do a Q&A at the end of each too, so we'll try and kind of save questions towards the end. But if there's something pressing or super relevant, maybe we'll jump into it. You'll Google your questions?
Yes.
I don't know the wireless password. What is it?
It's Evo Company. The Evo, O is a 0. Then capital D, capital T. Evo Company. Unless it's changing.
Let me make sure I'm connected too while we're here. It says I'm connected, but it also says I'm not. So there we go. Okay, cool. Alrighty. So, Angular 2. Exciting things. As you mentioned, my name is Andy Fleming. I'm the CTO over at Zest.io. So how many of you are using Angular 1 now in some form or fashion? Okay, good amount. Perfect. How many of you have checked out any of these new stuff with Angular 2? Okay, good chunk of you. You watch like the ng-conf videos or any of that? Okay, so I'll be talking through some of that, partly for people who don't know, and then we can kind of have some discussions around some of that. But yeah, wanted to cover a bunch of that. So a lot of you might be kind of deciding to, what front-end frameworks write. Things like, you've heard about React, you've been hearing more about Ember and Angular 2, and there's a lot of kind of, upsetness with the direction of Angular 2 recently. There wasn't a clear migration path. No kind of way forward. So if you had Angular 1, you're kind of stuck thinking, do I need to jump ship? Am I, going to be stuck with this? Or am I ready to start using Angular 2? So we're going to cover all that, basically. You might feel, if I can get my presentation to work, you might feel a little like this. So my hope is that by the end you feel a little more like this. little delayed. The internet's slow. So I wanted to just briefly cover what is Angular 4, in case you are completely new to Angular. Is there anyone that's kind of hasn't used Angular before? Okay, so we got a few people. So basically, Angular is great for single-page apps primarily. When you want a client-side app and you want to consume something like an API or data from different places and really have it work kind of independently. There's a number of other frameworks that kind of fill a similar spot. Like I mentioned, things like Ember and React is a tool for some of that, and people use Backbone and a bunch of stuff. But I personally like Angular. So the first thing I really wanted to talk about is performance. So that was kind of like a big theme. A lot of people talked about in kind of the Angular 1 world, it's not performant. And now some of you have maybe run into that, but probably a lot of you haven't. It's really kind of an interesting thing. The way I kind of describe it is, it's kind of like having a Ferrari and comparing it to like an F1 car, right? Like, if you're driving on the street, a Ferrari is just fine, right? So you'll get by, right? So, and it really depends on your use case, but Angular 1 for me, I've done a good amount of it. We started using it last year, and really we haven't ran into any major performance issues, and we've done an app with hundreds of views, not necessarily a ton of complexity as far as depth, but still some pretty solid usage, right? So now a lot of people too have said, well, what about React? React's the new exciting thing, right? Everybody's all about it. So I had a little fling with React, I'll admit. I was in that same boat, right? We're all looking at Angular 1, hearing these things about Angular 2, and starting to kind of peek at the other options, right? So React is really cool. This whole idea of one-way data flow and rendering these components, the whole idea that it's just components and components, right? If you've looked at any of that stuff, it's very cool, very performant, neat things. So some people got the idea, well, why don't we just add React to Angular 1? And that didn't work out so well. So there's actually a whole talk, which I'll link to at the end of the deck or online, that is a use case where they literally tried to implement React stuff in Angular 1. And there's cases where it works well, but at the end of the day, then you're mixing two frameworks. It's really kind of a messy situation. So the way I like to describe it now is really Angular 2 has the good parts of React, but all kind of stuck in with all the good parts of Angular, which is really exciting. So now there's a lot of magical performance. So I'll talk about what that actually looks like, though. So they built this kind of benchmark. So from the very beginning, they have really been focused on performance with Angular 2. They built this benchmark that they call Deep Tree, and what they wanted to do is just have this benchmark to see where are we at and have kind of a baseline. So they created this baseline, which is basically just in vanilla JavaScript. They said, how do we accomplish the same thing with this deeply nested app, and how performant is it? So one's our baseline. So in Angular 1.3, implementing the same thing takes about 8.5 times as long to do the rendering and all that, right? So not very performant. So Angular 2 is a huge step in the right direction. It takes 3 times as long. And when you're comparing, any framework to vanilla JavaScript, there's always going to be overhead, right? So, 3 times is pretty reasonable. Now, one thing that's really exciting, though, is they've gotten really intelligent with Angular 2 because of how they built it, which I'll talk about a little bit. It is able to be smarter with views. So they have this concept called view caching. And what view caching does is, rather than every time go through and kind of compile the template and render it out and all that, they're actually able to do some of that process and then reuse it. So when that's utilized in Angular 2, it's about 1.5 times the baseline, which is awesome. So it's extremely performant. There's, like I said, I'll link to a couple videos specifically about it. There's whole things that go in depth, some cool comparisons to React. But basically, no longer a concern. They've made that a hugely important thing for Angular 2. So simplicity. So another big theme of Angular 2 is simplicity. Basically, kind of making things easier, right? So in Angular 1, it was built something like 5 years ago at Google as really just a tool for rapid prototyping. They wanted a quick way, mainly for like designers and kind of front-end engineers, just to put something together to test out how it feels and do all that. It really wasn't built for the things we use it for today, and they've done a decent job trying to move us forward in that, but it's been a long time, right? So at first, they were going to introduce this new language called TypeScript. How many of you guys have heard of that? So they introduced a new thing called TypeScript. I heard about it and I was kind of like, great, another new language, just what we need. One more thing, and I'm like, and it's specifically for Angular, like, why do they need their own language? I'm like, I'm really not liking this. That was when I was on the road to React at that point. So what they've done actually, though, is they said, forget TypeScript, we're going to go with TypeScript. So there's a lot of kind of meaning behind this and a lot of interesting things. I'm going to talk more about TypeScript specifically later, but basically, TypeScript was really close to TypeScript already. It was just kind of with a couple extra specific pieces of functionality for TypeScript. So specifically, that's annotations, which I'll cover a little bit. But basically, what's cool about this is they're going a little more towards an open standard in that. And the funny part is Microsoft makes TypeScript. So like Microsoft and Google have partnered on this to get together and say, we're going to make this work, which is kind of like surprising, right? So, but nonetheless, very cool, and you'll start to see some of why that is, but it's a good thing. So that's a step in the right direction. So annotations, we'll see a specific example of this, but basically what annotations are is a way to provide metadata for your code. It's a way to simply say, this particular piece of code is used for something else. What you'll see is just a really nice way to simplify some of the syntax. So I wanted to talk briefly about the directives API. So how many of you have built a directive in Angular 1? Okay, so you've probably had an experience like this. If you know what the words compiler and link and pre-link and post-link and all that means, you've been through the pain, through the struggle, right? A lot of people kind of like, or there's this guy, Ben Nadell, who has this chart who talks about learning Angular. It's this like roller coaster of like, oh, that's awesome, and like, oh, I hate it, and it's like, Angular's like so great and so terrible all at the same time. So I thought that was hilarious. So I wanted to show you an actual kind of new kind of directive, or what they now call a component directive. So this is in Angular 2 what a component directive looks like. So I'll talk through what's kind of on screen here and kind of what it means. So up top we have an annotation. So when you see the @ symbol, that there is an annotation. So this is declaring that what's below is a component. And then it has a selector, which is greeter, which we'll see in a second how that fits in. And then we're binding a property called name. So then the next annotation is the template. So we can have external templates here, or just for the sake of this example, we use an inline one. but it's real simple. Kind of the syntax we're used to seeing, right? We have a, the double curly braces, and then in here we're just calling this function greeting. So how this actually works and how it looks, we can see here, this is the component, how we'd write it in a template somewhere. We give it the directive kind of tag, which is greeter in this case, so that matches my selector up there. And then we're passing in this property of name, right? So when this actually renders, it would output like this. It would say, hi, Joe. Or actually, I totally have a typo in there. It would say, hello, Joe, right? Beautiful, yeah. I just wanted to show off the internationalization. So I do want to mention, too, they actually have done some stuff with internationalization. I'll probably talk briefly about that later. But, yes.
Are those annotations bound to that class, that app component?
Yes. So I just briefly wanted to talk about unidirectional data flow and what that means. It's kind of a little bit of a complex topic, but really it's the beauty of React. And what it means is data only goes one way in your application. When a change happens, rather than updating something in the controller, do something, it makes a full loop around. So there's a consistent workflow and an easy path to follow in the code. It's something that, once again, is a little deeper topic, but it's really important to know that they're doing that in Angular too. It's a big piece of why some of the stuff like the syntax has to change, and some of those pieces and the way it works is to get that power of one-way data flow, we need that. And that's going to make debugging easier. That's going to make just everything a lot smoother. So kind of matches in with that theme of simplicity. So I wanted to show kind of an example of this and how we still kind of have some access to it. And just show some actual more real syntax of Angular 2. So here I have an input. I just have the type text. And there's this little hash that says my input value. So this is what they call a local variable in Angular 2. So if you were in Angular 1, you would probably do something like ng model, right? So you would say ng model is my input value. Now, what's bad about that in the kind of data flow terms of things is it's then putting code back into your controller, or putting that new value back into your controller, and there's this back and forth of the two-way data binding. And if something else happens in the code in your controller, it's possible to change its value. It's just not well controlled. There's not a clear flow of data. It can come in either way to that input, and that's part of what makes it really hard to debug. So here, kind of the syntax of how we use this local variable is that's no longer in our controller in the same way, where it can be changed. But what's cool is it's updated. So in our view here, I have a button, and you'll see I say do something with my input value. So that's the idea, is when you declare a local variable binding like that, it then gives you that availability in your template. I'll also point out while we're here, you'll notice the click in the parentheses. So that's the new syntax for binding events. Rather than saying ng click, it's just in parentheses and says click, which is different, but I really like it. There's some other syntax I won't get into for some of the different things, but they also use brackets for some other stuff like the classes rather than doing ng class. And part of what's good about this, though, too, is these templates now get kind of like compiled, so you don't actually see all this stuff in your DOM anymore, which is really nice. So it's nice and clean, a lot more kind of behind the scenes and strong kind of internals to it, which is cool. It's no longer XHTML compliant? No, so this is, because this is specifically loaded independently, this isn't actually in your DOM.
Right, no, I get that.
Yeah. So, so there'd probably be a separate, like, in like an IDE, for example, I'm sure there'll be a syntax mode for Angular templates. But yeah, no, that's a good point. So that said, I really like it that it's clear that it's different than just my other attributes that I have on my elements. It's well defined that this is something specific to Angular. It's also not as like bulky and ugly as ng everything to me personally. But that's just a little about that. So, I mean, either way, some exposure to it. And then I wanted to talk about the new router, because this is really like a really important piece. So basically, how many of you guys have used UI router? Cool. So most of you. Most of you know that the normal router in Angular 1 is a little brutal, like really limited. And it's kind of funny, everybody in the community knows it, and the go-to is just UI router. So what they've done with Angular 2 is they've basically taken all the good parts of UI router and brought it into Angular 2, or into this Angular 2 router. So, so here's the actual syntax of it. So if, to your app, you would bind, or you would set this route config. So basically, it's just this object that has our configuration in here. So you can have a path. And in this case, I really specifically wanted to show what it's like to have two separate sibling views. So in this case, there's two separate components that it stems at, my user list and my user. So you'll see down here in the actual kind of template code, we use this ng viewport tag. And so there we say, for example, the first one is master, so you can see that's going to map to the user list component, and then the detail one is going to map to the user component. What's cool about this is it's on the same path, so similar to stuff you can do in UI router, a lot of flexibility for nesting and sibling views and those kind of things, as well as named views. Very similar as well, you can use ng-link to say I want to link to a specific component, and it'll resolve that link for you, which is handy. Now, let's see, I'll come back to that. So there's so much we could talk about with it, but wanted to keep it kind of short and sweet, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the migration stuff. But one of the big questions is like release date. Regardless of if I like it or not, when can I actually use it, right? So Google has said they plan to migrate 2 major apps in May to Angular 2. It's already in alpha, but there's still things that could change. So it's not production ready, but they're pushing it forward, as fast as can be. The team, I think, is almost doubled in size now for Angular, between just kind of online contributors and people from different companies, as well as they've merged with the Dart team, or part of the Dart team, I think. Which is awesome. So it's moving super, super quickly. So, yeah. So the Dart team, so Dart is a different sort of language that Dart, yeah, that you.
Yeah, you said Dart.
Gotcha. The Dart team. Yeah. So the Dart team, right? Yeah, underground. So, yeah, exactly. So anyway, so hopefully sometime, like maybe June, but we have no idea, right? So in the meantime, you can use the alpha still. There's actually a Yeoman generator for it, if you guys are familiar with that. So you can, and that'll actually continue to track with the alpha as they update it. So you guys can experiment with it, but it's not quite ready to be used. So then the next question is, well, if I want to use Angular 2 and move towards that, how do I actually prepare to migrate to it? So there's a few big things. One is Angular 1.4, which is the next version. It's not currently out, but it is in, it's not even in beta. There's a release candidate out. So you can actually go start using that with that and testing if you run into bugs, but it should be pretty, close to production ready. Like I wouldn't hesitate to start a new project with it. Now the other big piece is the new router is actually backwards compatible, where you can map to both Angular 1 controllers as well as Angular 2 components. So that's a huge piece of it. If you're planning on building a new app or starting to migrate another one, if you can migrate the router, that's like the first piece. And the way they've tried to make it as much as possible so you can do this in an incremental way. It's still definitely in a lot of places going to be syntax changes, different things for templates and that. To really get all the power of it, that's how it has to be. But using the new router, you can then use parts of Angular 1, parts of Angular 2, and you can kind of take either approach of kind of loading Angular 1 and Angular 2 to bring stuff into the Angular 1 world, or you can kind of start from the Angular 2 world and start bringing in your Angular 1 pieces and then slowly migrating that. So there's some specific talks that talk through the details of that, but they've definitely thought that through, which is cool. So the whole support plan for all that is significantly better. They've also assigned someone to specifically lead the Angular 1 team to continue supporting that and kind of driving that forward. I mentioned as well internationalization. That's something that's making its way into Angular 1.4, some new tools for that. So if you guys have to deal with any of that, that'll be available. There's a number of other things that they're doing that are going to be compatible for 1.4 as well, including if you guys are into the material design stuff, they're doing a whole NG material kind of package for that, which is cool. The other way you can kind of get ready is ECMAScript 6 modules. And I'll show kind of a brief example of how this looks kind of compared to Angular 1.4 versus Angular 2. So this is a diff for a component in Angular 1.4 and then in Angular 2. So they've kind of put some more sensible defaults in here to make this new component. So in this case, it's this narwhal component. And the important part really to see here is that, yeah, the actual kind of code that binds to Angular and does those things is definitely different. But if you look at the bottom at the class, the actual controller, where the business logic lives, it doesn't have to change at all. So if you structure, especially if you're building something new, if you use these ES6 classes and do it right, you're able to bring that into both Angular 1 and Angular 2, and then later not have to touch those, which is a big deal, right? Like it's a little bit cleaner. It's one thing you're not going to have to mess with. So, yeah. Cool. So that's really just, a brief look into some of that stuff. We can kind of go through some questions and talk through some more, and then after, I'm happy to chat all night about Angular. But what do you guys want to know? Yeah.
So, do you see the examples of TypeScript in the demo so far?
Yes. So, so this as well as the one we saw earlier. Yes, so the annotation syntax specifically here is TypeScript. So, and we'll see a little more TypeScript. What's really cool about TypeScript, though, the short version is that JavaScript is valid TypeScript, so it's not like a huge, like you don't have to modify any of your code going into TypeScript. It's just additional tools on top. So the annotations is what was specifically in AppScript that wasn't in TypeScript before, that they actually are adding to TypeScript. And that version of TypeScript actually isn't out yet. It's TypeScript 1.5, and it's in development. Yeah.
So just that you don't have to use TypeScript.
Correct.
You can still write everything in ES6.
Yeah. So there's a syntax specifically for doing the annotations without, or doing the same job as the annotations without actually writing annotations. That said, I'd probably lean towards using TypeScript, and we'll talk a little about that for a number of reasons. But even for Angular, it's a little cleaner, a little more straightforward, in my opinion. Yeah.
Would you say that the new router in Angular 2 is a good replacement for the UI router at this point?
Yes, absolutely. From everything I know about it, it supports all the same stuff, and it's going to be better for migrating. They're talking about trying to work out a migration path for UI router as well, but it's going to be tough. Like they've built specifically, they've taken all the good parts of UI router, put it in theirs, and made it ready for that kind of migration world. Yeah.
I don't know if I missed it. When you were talking about performance and baseline, what is that baseline based on?
So it's in vanilla JavaScript, but they wrote their own benchmark for it. So they basically built an app that has some deep views and different stuff and some complexity to it. I don't know the specifics of it. I think they may have it available online. But basically, it's just a big, deep test to do some complex things where there's specific performance challenges and things like that.
In native JavaScript.
Yeah, so the baseline is in native JavaScript. So they're trying to do the exact same thing like the app they build, except in vanilla JavaScript.
You know, like the service API,
I'm not familiar with how that's changing over. I imagine, I think some of it's changing, but I think there's still a service structure like that, or directive, per se. Yeah. Yeah, so we'll get all into TypeScript in the next talk. There's a ton of good stuff there. Mm-hmm.
So has that changed and or now targeting that?
Yeah, I think that they have. I don't know if it's the the same focus as it was, but I definitely I'm sure that's still very much